Well, thank you so much for coming, both those in person as well as online. Most of our viewers are online. There is not too big a crowd, Christiana. Roman Roads is a publisher of classical curriculum, and we love C.S. Lewis. And we love authors who love C.S. Lewis. Matter of fact, our flagship curriculum, Old Western Culture, is a term coined by C.S. Lewis to represent the ideas that have been held in common throughout most of human history until recent times. Ideas, books, thoughts, and he talked about that in his On the Description of Times, which Christiana has read because Christiana has read everything that Lewis has ever published, which is quite the feat. So Christiana is the author of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy. And she graduated summa cum laude from New St. Andrews College, where we are here today, with an MA in Theology and Letters in 2017. Her graduate research focused on one of her favorite authors, Lewis, and his love of medieval cosmology and medieval and Renaissance literature, particularly as seen through Lewis's Space Trilogy. Who wrote this? Ransom trilogy. I copied the text, and you'll find out that that matters. I don't know if you actually cover that in this lecture, but it's definitely in the book. Over the last 2 years, she has been completing her MFA in creative writing through New St. Andrews College, continuing to develop as a writer. She has been teaching at Logos School here in Moscow at a for secondary Latin and English as an English teacher for the last 2 years, though she has more than 10 years teaching experience on a wide range of topics. Her academic interests focus on the writings of C.S. Lewis and the literature of the medieval Renaissance period through the early modern era. Her book, Deeper Heaven, A Reader's Guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, the culmination of years of research, was released in January 2021 by Roman Roads Press and has received praise from such scholars as Dr. Michael Ward, William O. Flaherty, and Dr. Diana Geiler. She is currently working on a final draft of a middle grade novel, as well as research for another nonfiction project on Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces. Christiana grew up in North Idaho and has lived in Moscow for the last 10 years. She lives in a cheery house with her 2 sisters and enjoys walking downtown, haunting the local coffee shop, hiking with friends, and eating Sunday dinners with the rest of her family. So without further ado, Christiana.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you a bit about C.S. Lewis and about
The trivia.
the trivia. Yes, we are doing a trivia. We're doing a giveaway, apparently. I was informed. And so am I giving the question now then?
Yes, so that they're
For the
thinking about
trivia?
it throughout the lecture.
Okay, so this was kind of sprung on me a little bit last minute here. So came up with a trivia question. And the trivia question for the giveaway, I think we're giving away a book, right? Book,
and the mug.
copy, and the mug too, which is very exciting. I didn't ever expect to have my name on a mug. So, that's something. You really arrived when you have your name on a mug, I think. So, yes, definitely. So the trivia question is, what is the farewell in Old Solar that Ransom gives to Jane at the end of That Hideous Strength? I think he also says it to the Dimbles as well. So he says it at least 2 times. So that's the question. We'll see if anyone can come up with the answer there. So as Daniel introduced, I am a soon-to-be 3-time graduate of NSA, so you can safely say, I'm definitely an alum. I mean, I'm an alum and an alum and an alum, right? And I love NSA, and I'm really excited that they asked me to come and speak here. And I'm really excited to just share some of the things that I've been researching and pulling together that I pulled together for this book, but I've kind of drawn some threads out and woven them together for this specific talk. So there's some things I'm going to be talking about that I don't talk about in the book, which is really fun. You can always go even deeper, right? Deeper than Deeper Heaven. So that's something I love about Lewis, is that you can continually grow and just see more things with every read through of his books. So my talk title is The Spark of Speech, talking about Lewis, language and the liberal arts in That Hideous Strength. And there's a lot of things going on in that title. And I will confess, I came up with the title first and then said, okay, now I have a title, I have to write a talk about this. So as I was sitting down to kind of thread all these things together, I'm hoping that it will all make sense to you as we go through this. So I'm going to attempt to connect several seemingly disparate things: C.S. Lewis, Mercury, language, That Hideous Strength, and the liberal arts. And those at first glance might all seem to be very, very different things, but I'm hoping to show that they are not and that they're all connected. And so we're going to start by talking about Mercury, which, if again, as a brief intro, if you don't know, Lewis loved the medieval cosmology. That's kind of his whole orientation for the Ransom trilogy, and why I don't think we should call it the space trilogy, because that's one of his main points that he makes at the end of the first book, is that we shouldn't be looking up and seeing it as space, but we should try to use the more biblical terminology of the heavens instead. And so there's lots of arguments for what we should actually call this trilogy, maybe the cosmological trilogy, which I think is just a mouthful. I go with the Ransom trilogy because it's short, concise, and it's all about ransom, so it makes sense. But the medieval cosmos was, one of the things that Lewis loved about the medieval cosmos was the personality of the planets themselves. That every planet in this system had a personality beyond just being a physical object in the sky. There's a personality or a being, angelic being, associated with each of those planets, and they kind of all put under a microscope certain attributes of God, and by putting them together into kind of one personality, you can kind of separate them out and just enjoy them a little bit more in a certain way. And so Mercury himself is the one I want to talk about. I don't talk too much about Mercury in this book, so this is kind of special for this talk, but the title, The Spark of Speech, is the title of my talk, and that is from a line of poetry in Lewis's poem, The Planets, which I think encapsulates everything that Lewis loved about the planetary personalities. It's a really wonderful poem. It's an alliterative poem, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety because it's really quite wonderful. But I'm going to read a little bit from the section on Mercury. Let me get that here. And then I'm going to pull a few things out from this poem that I want to highlight. So this is on Mercury. Next beyond her, Mercury marches. Madcap rover, patron of pilferers, pert quicksilver, his gaze begets goblin mineral, merry multitude of meeting selves, same but sundered. From the soul's darkness with wreathed wand, words he marshals, guides and gathers them, gay bellwether of flocking fancies. His flint has struck the spark of speech from spirit's tinder. Lord of language, he leads forever the spangle and splendor, sport that mingles sound with senses, in subtle pattern, words and wedlock, and wedding also of thing with thought. So that's the section on Mercury from that, and you can hopefully see the alliteration going on. In each line, he plays with the repetition of sounds, right? He does that through the whole poem, not just this section on Mercury. But a few things to note: Mercury is the Lord of language. So there's a connection. Mercury, language, both in my title, right? Language, and so that emphasis is something that Lewis draws out again and again, especially in That Hideous Strength, is the emphasis on Mercury, the connection between Mercury and language. He mingles sound with senses and weds thing with thought. That line in particular, weds thing with thought, is something that I'm going to kind of run with through That Hideous Strength. So you have to bear with me because I have an argument. We'll see if it works. Connecting that to Jane and Mark Studdick in That Hideous Strength. So the mercurial, which is a very hard word to say, spirit is also difficult to pin down, right? And Lewis says that himself. He says it's really hard to kind of pin down what this spirit is like. And if you really want to understand it, you really should just put some quicksilver in a dish and watch it, right? Kind of how it darts around and it connects and then disperses, and right, there's this kind of dancing sort of element to it, speed and nimbleness and alacrity, he says, all of those words associated with Mercury. Also, not just physical alacrity, but mental acuity, right? That the language, the gymnastics kind of that language can do, especially in poetry, is something that Mercury embodies. And so I want to read one more thing from Lewis because I think it really gives us even more insight into the mercurial spirit, and that is from, I think, one of the absolute best chapters, the descent of the gods in That Hideous Strength, when all of the planetary personalities come down to Earth, and he just basically gives an entire page sometimes to each of the planets, and it's just quite excellent. So I'm going to read this little section about Mercury here. Upstairs, this first change had a different operation. There came an instant at which both men, Ransom and Merlin are upstairs in this room, which both men braced themselves. Ransom gripped the side of his sofa. Merlin grasped his own knees and set his teeth. A rod of colored light, whose color no man can name or picture, darted between them. No more to see than that, but seeing was the least part of their experience. Quick agitation seized them, a kind of boiling and bubbling in mind and heart, which shook their bodies also. It went to a rhythm of such fierce speed that they feared their sanity must be shaken into 1,000 fragments. And then it seemed that this had actually happened. But it did not matter, for all the fragments, needle-pointed desires, brisk merriments, lynx-eyed thoughts, went rolling to and fro like glittering drops and reunited themselves. It was well that both men had some knowledge of poetry. The doubling, splitting, and recombining of thoughts which now went on in them would have been unendurable for one whom that art had not already instructed in the counterpoint of the mind, the mastery of doubled and trebled vision. For Ransom, whose study had been for many years in the realm of words, it was heavenly pleasure. He found himself sitting within the very heart of language, in the white-hot furnace of essential speech. All fact was broken, splashed into cataracts, caught, turned inside out, kneaded, slain, and reborn as meaning. For the Lord of meaning himself, the herald, the messenger, the slayer of Argus, was with them, the angel that spins nearest the sun, Viratriblia, whom men call Mercury and Thoth. So I think, I don't really have anything to add to that. I mean, that kind of encapsulates, again, if you picture Quicksilver, Mercury in a dish, he captures that in this combining and separating of words and meaning. So kind of putting a pin in Mercury, I wanted to move on a little bit to talk about Mark and Jane in that his strength. So we have language and Mercury up here, put that on a shelf, and now we're going to move over to that his strength. You could say, if you were to summarize that his strength, it's almost just like a book on marriage counseling, really. The first word of the book is matrimony, and the whole book is really about Mark and Jane and their relationship, or the problems with their relationship and how that relationship is restored by the end of the book. And throughout this book, you can see how their individual personalities and their individual weaknesses draw them in completely different directions. And as I was thinking about this more, I was thinking, well, they're completely separate for most of the book when they really should be together, and how like that is to Mercury and his sort of personality, right? This splitting and joining, and they really should be, they're fractured where they should be together, and they're not, so they're not together when they should be, and they're not, when they are together, and they're not together in the right way. So kind of keeping that in mind as we're talking about this. But Mark and Jane, and I think you've probably heard some people talk about this before. I know Pastor Wilson has talked about this when he's talked about that hideous strength, but they both have opposite temptations, right? Mark's temptation is he wants to be in, right? He wants to be included. He wants to be in the inner ring, as Lewis calls it. There's an excellent essay that Lewis wrote called The Inner Ring that's found in the Weight of Glory collection of essays. And his desperate fear is to be left out, right? He wants to be in. He wants to get in with the cool crowd, and then once he's in the cool crowd, he wants to figure out, well, who in the cool crowd is in the know the most, and then get in with them. And right, his fear is being left out in the dark and not knowing what's going on. He constantly is trying to be in the in crowd, and to that end, he's constantly kind of going along without much thought right behind it. He's just going along with what they're saying. He's letting them manipulate him and letting them manipulate him into helping them with their manipulations, right? He ends up writing some articles for them for this newspaper, and he's realizing that he's writing complete hogwash, right? It's completely not true. It's all manipulation, and yet he's been kind of cajoled into that position where he's now part of that manipulative effort. And so, but it's kind of too late, right? By the time he realizes it, the fear of being cast out again is so great that he just can't even make that move to extricate himself. Jane, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. She wants to get out, right? She doesn't want to be involved. She wants to just be left alone. She wants to resort to her ivory tower with her manuscripts and her really boring essay on Donne the thesis on Donne that she's working on and that no one really cares about. But she just wants, to kind of resort to the comfort of academia, which I think as NSA alums or perhaps NSA students, we can relate to a little bit. Just let me do my research, right? Let me just hole up somewhere and do my research. But that's not her calling in this moment, in this marriage, right? She and Mark are both abdicating from their roles in this relationship. He by wanting to get in with the wrong people, and her by trying to remove herself from the right people, primarily her husband, right? They're at loggerheads from the beginning of the book. And how this relates to education, because that's also liberal arts education, it's also part of this talk, is I think found in the fact that Lewis explicitly says that his argument in That Hideous Strength is the same as the one he makes in The Abolition of Man. He says that in the preface to That Hideous Strength. And so, we have to go look at The Abolition of Man. What is The Abolition of Man actually about? And it is Lewis's critique of a certain form of education that was becoming very popular in his day, and I think we can see the repercussions of that education now in our current culture, that was creating a certain type of people. And Mark, I think, and Jane, both, are examples of the sorts of people that this sort of education produces. And his word for it was, it produces men without chests, right? It was probably all heard, we're all, again, kind of in this world, we are all Lewis fans, so I think we've heard of that phrase. But it's a very interesting phrase because what does it mean? You kind of need to unpack it. Okay. So classically, the chest was considered the seat of, as Lewis says, this is a quote from his book. It's actually from The Abolition of Man. Sorry, I'm just checking my footnotes to make sure I'm saying the right thing. So he says that the chest was seen as the seat of, quote, emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiment, end quote. So there's a difference in this way of thinking between emotion as stable sentiment and just pure appetite or desire. So the stomach was actually the seat of your desires and kind of what we think of as raw emotion. And then, of course, you have the head, which is the seat of the intellect and reason and rationality and logic. And as with this form, the medieval period especially, they liked their threes. You have to have three things to kind of keep the balance. The chest was the thing that balanced it. It's the seat of stable emotion, of informed and disciplined virtue, you could say, right? That balanced out the other two. Without that middle element, you're either going to slide into just giving into raw appetite and being driven by just kind of a hedonistic sort of search for pleasure, whatever you want, right? Whatever makes you happy. Or the other side, cold logic, reason, rationality with nothing to balance that out. And so I think we see with Mark and Jane, we see kind of these two temptations to slide either direction. Jane is sliding towards the cold, logical reason side of things, and Mark is sliding towards appetite. We even see that with some very, very subtle things like he starts smoking more and drinking more, and right, because he's trying to get in with the in crowd, right? And so he starts giving in to those just appetites. And so they're both sliding different directions. Again, think Mercury, right? They're sliding apart in different directions where they shouldn't be. And it's primarily a result of the kind of education that they both received. And their individual temptations are a result of their, I think, natural propensities in their character and their personalities. But they are both temptations in this sort of education without that middle element of just, like we said, stable sentiment. And so this entire relationship between them, I think, is mercurial in the improper sense, in the sense that they are apart when they should be together. And so obviously I am speaking to, as an NSA alum, again, kind of going back to that theme, and to a lot of NSA alums or current NSA students. And so what does all of this, Mercury, language, Jane and Mark, have to do with the liberal arts, right? I put that in my title for a reason. And I think the education offered here at NSA is diametrically opposed to this sort of education that Lewis is critiquing in The Abolition of Man and in That Hideous Strength. It's an education focused not primarily on teaching a single skill, but on creating a certain kind of person. And the liberal arts is called that not just because it is the education of free people, but that it is actually concerned with creating free people. And people who are not enslaved to either their animal appetite or cold logic and reason, but that are balanced, well-rounded individuals, right? With rightly ordered loves. I have to say that in a talk to NSA alums because, freshman year, Augustine, we all remember that, right? So both Mark and Jane, in their individual weaknesses, have their moment of conversion, you could say, and both have to do with fighting against their natural temptation, right? Jane's comes in when she has to actually submit, when she does not want to submit. She wants to be her own person. She wants to be out and separate. She has to actually submit to first to God primarily, but then to her husband as well. And Mark's has to do with standing up and not submitting, right? He has to actually step out and say, no, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to do what you're asking of me. And so the liberal arts, again, are focused on creating people who are able to do what ultimately Mark and Jane did, hopefully without all that interim stuff, because we actually were given this foundation to build on. And I think the key there is focusing on what freedom actually means, right? Our culture wants to be kind of like Jane, which says that to be free is to not be bound by anything, right? But we know that we have to be bound by something. We're either going to be bound by something higher and greater than ourselves, or we're going to be bound by ourselves. And no one wants to be that, right? The more bound you are by God's word, the more free you are to be who God created you to be. And like I said, our culture thinks that true freedom means not having to submit to anything, not being bound by any rules or boundaries. But they don't realize that being bound by nothing higher than yourselves, you're actually more limited in what you can do. And here, this is a rather, I would say, homely example. Let's say you don't know the rules of chess. You are therefore free from the rules of chess. You are not bound by them. However, you are bound by your limitation of not being able to ever play chess, right? The actual rules and boundaries formed by the game of chess enable you to actually play it. It doesn't exist if you don't know those rules, if you don't have those boundaries. Or to continue with another analogy, the more discipline you learn at a certain skill, the more you understand the rules and boundaries of certain forms of art, painting or playing an instrument, the more freedom you have to create and express, right? If you don't know about light and color and depth and shadow, you're only ever going to paint very flat things, right? The more you learn about those sorts of rules and requirements, the more free you are to create excellent art. Same thing goes with writing. I teach 8th grade English, so I tell my students this a lot. I say, writers actually do write fragments sometimes. And they're all shocked by that, scandalized. You write fragments? Like, yes, and they actually are allowed to, but you cannot do it accidentally, right? There's a saying, and I looked it up. People have attributed it to Oscar Wilde, but I don't think that's actually true, that a gentleman is someone who never insults anyone accidentally. So you know what you're doing, right? When you do it on purpose. And I might say a writer is someone who never breaks the rules accidentally, right? If you are allowed to break the rules, but you're doing it for a very particular reason. Once you know what the rules are, you've mastered the rules, then I say, you are allowed to write a fragment because you've chosen. I was like, I am writing a fragment here on purpose for this specific reason, to communicate a certain idea or a certain emotion at this particular moment. And those are the writers that have the most freedom to do that. The ones that know the rules, know how to follow them, know where the boundaries are, and then can say, I'm going to go over here for a moment because I think it suits this purpose. I'm going to do it this way. And so the education that we as alums and current NSA students received at NSA is one that equips us to step out into a sin-enslaved world as free men and women who know whom they serve and are thus free to be what we are called to be, which is men and women serving the Creator of all. And people who have that steadying weight of ordered virtue to balance both the appetite and the reason, that stable sentiment that is oriented towards serving God faithfully wherever He has us, we are able to use the tools primarily language, to go back to Mercury, right? Language and words. That is what he's given us to communicate with each other and primarily to communicate the gospel. And we're supposed to use them not as the NICE, the nice do, by twisting and manipulating the truth, which we see all the time, especially if you ever just open Facebook for 2 seconds, right? Very quickly we're learning to not trust everything that we see. But we're supposed to be servants of the truth and use words and language in a way that is submissive to that boundary. And that should, again, set us free to use it the way we're called to. And using that language shapes us even as we shape it. We can either use it in a way that distorts the truth or a way that sets bound men free. And the education that many of us have received here has given us the freedom and discipline to communicate this good news to a very, very dark world that is very much in need of it. And so we communicate it in truth and goodness and beauty with winged feet like Mercury, right? Because he's the messenger god. Right. And I had to just end, I just was connecting Mercury and the gospel and good news. And so it reminded me of the verse, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. Right. That's what we're called to do. And that's what NSA has uniquely equipped us to, I think. And I'm very grateful to have received that in so many different ways. And I'm excited to be able to give that back in a small way with this book that is the culmination of research and mostly just learning from a lot of wonderful people, most of them here at this school. And so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for having me to talk. And I think we have some time probably for some questions, so if there are any. But thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah. We also need to get an answer to the trivia question at some point. Oh, the question again was, what is the farewell in Old Solar that Ransom gives to Jane at the end of that hideous strength? So, yeah.
Urendi Maladil?
What'd you say?
Urendi Maladil?
Yes, that's it. That is it. Oh, woo, we got that one. I was worried it'd be too hard, so we had a backup if we needed to, but I'm very impressed. So that was good. So you get a book and a mug. It's exciting, yeah. But I'm open to, any questions or even about the book or background or anything like that. Anything. Anything about C.S. Lewis, really. Yes.
Yeah, could you talk a little more about Lewis's idea of language and how words relate to meaning and thought? Because that's something I've been wondering a little more about, having read both of this and then more recently, The Man Who Was Thursday, and how this Thursday character is kind of this character that represents poetry and language. So.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, and I do have a couple chapters in here on language and poetry. So in Lewis's essay, there's an essay he wrote in, I think it's in The Weight of Glory. Actually, I think I put it down here somewhere. It's called Transposition, which is a really good essay. And he's talking about how in even just in this world, when we speak, the fact that language is far more than its material parts, obviously, which is kind of an argument against materialism. He likes arguing against materialism a lot. But that, what I'm saying right now is far more than just the sound waves and the particles and all of that. It's actually, I'm communicating meaning that somehow is going from my head to your head and hopefully making sense. Hopefully staying, I'm communicating what is actually in my mind and you are receiving it and it's staying intact. That's what good communication is. And that in itself is a spiritual discipline, really, right? Meaning is more than just the physical parts. If I'm writing something, it's far more than just the ink on the page, right? So, I'm still researching that. I didn't get too deep into the weeds on this. This book was intended for lay people to kind of as an introduction to the Ransom trilogy, because it is there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack, and I got so many questions about just what is Merlin doing, and it's so weird. I don't get it, and so it's more of an effort to hopefully inspire people to go deeper. So I know there's a lot more to say on language and poetry in particular, but in Transposition, he talks about poetry as being kind of the on another plane of meaning than regular prose, and that if that's the case here, how much more will it be post resurrection? Like, couldn't there be even another plane beyond that? And that's when he's talking also about his idea of trans-sensual, which is meaning trans as in across, and that we have that experience now with, he uses the example of music, that there's something about music that even, I mean, if you've ever experienced a perfect chord in perfect unison and there's these overtones, it's the strangest thing. I've only experienced it one time. It's the strangest thing. It's like all the hairs on your arm stand up, and it just, you feel this weird visceral reaction to hearing those. Everything's just perfectly in line. And Dr. Erb freaked out when it happened. I was in a choir, so you can probably picture him dancing around, and he's like, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" Right? And I was like, "Yes, we all heard it. We didn't know what it was." But and that there's, even here in this fallen world, there's something, there's another layer of spiritual reality to the physical world and how we experience it. And so if that happens now, how much more will that be true post-resurrection and in eternity? So, and he kind of applies that to language too. And again, it's very complex. So I don't know if I even answered your question at all. It's something that I think you could write a whole book on just what Lewis thought about language and its relationship to meaning. I think the mercury element, that comment in the poem, wedding thing with thought, is really fascinating. I was thinking of it in terms of Mark and Jane, because Mark is almost all, he's kind of the thing with no thought, right? He just goes and he acts without, and he wants to be a part of kind of this club without really any individual independent thought on his own. And Jane wants to be all thought with no reality behind it. She just wants to be kind of the brain in the vat, right? The head, right? I just want to be left alone in my ivory tower studying and just be a thought with no reality. And so both of them have to repent of those, the things they're missing, right? And then when they are joined back together as the way they should be, I think it's almost pointing towards what he's getting at in kind of a physical way. But again, there's a lot more to be said on that topic, I think. So this is a very good question. Again, I think I just probably raised more questions. Yes.
I'm intrigued. You made a mention of Mark starting out wanting to be part of the in crowd, and because of his skills with language, he's now writing articles that are tame to start with, and then get worse and worse, get more and more further and further away from the truth. I'm wondering about the ethics of the use of language. I mean, it's clean when you are preaching the gospel and you know that you're presenting the gospel well. That's easy. And a flat out lie where you're trying to dupe somebody, that's pretty easy also. But how do you cut the use of language? How do you describe the use of language ethically when it's somewhere in the middle? Specifically, I'm a voice actor, and when I get a script that wants me to push something that I'm not so sure about, you get sticky, and I don't know. I'm still fighting in my head. Where do I draw my line?
Yeah,
Wondering if you want to.
I mean, I haven't really thought too much about that in terms of specifically voice acting and the ethics behind. If you're hired to do a certain thing, where do you draw the line at doing that? I mean, that's a tricky situation. But it's interesting that you bring up though just the ethics of basically using rhetoric to influence someone. I actually had this conversation with my 8th graders today in English class. We were talking about logos, pathos, and ethos as 3 building blocks of rhetoric in a way, and how we were also talking a little bit about informal fallacies. So pathos, is an appeal to emotions, trying to gin up sympathy or have someone influence someone's feelings in a certain direction. And we were brought up the fact that ad misericordiam is the appeal to sympathy, which is an informal fallacy, but that's not always a problem. If you were going to a funeral and giving a speech at a funeral, someone shouldn't come up to you afterwards and say, you were doing a lot of appealing to our emotions there in that talk. I'm not so sure that that's a little informal fallacy going on. It's like, well, no, this is the suitable situation to have that rhetorical device. It is an emotionally fraught situation, and to ignore the emotion in that situation would be unkind and would be unfitting. It wouldn't be fitting, it wouldn't be suitable. So there is a time and a place to use all of those rhetorical devices. I think ultimately we're always in submission to the Word of God and to the truth. We are in submission to the truth. So is this a situation where I am trying to get my audience to feel a certain way that is in accordance with the truth? Then I say that's a good thing. You should want them to feel the way they should feel. And it's okay to use emotional rhetoric to do that. If you're using it in a way that is misdirecting people from your argument, that's where it becomes an informal fallacy. We're having an actual debate going on here, and I'm distracting from the actual point by saying, things like, oh, well, you must hate children. Right? It's like, we're not talking about, that's again, or just throwing something out there that is distracting from the actual truth of the argument. That's when it becomes an issue. So again, I don't know if I'm actually answering your specific question, but I ultimately, obviously this might be a cop-out, is that we're submitting to the will of God, we're submitting to the truth of His Word, and so we have to tell the truth, and in how we appeal to people's emotions. You can have a true emotion, and you can have a situation where I'm actually twisting people's emotions to be something they ought not to be. We're talking about Julius Caesar, the play, Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony's speech, right, that is fraught with pathos, right? And he's, yes, honorable man, right? And he starts out very subtle, and it gets kind of more and more, and he's working up the crowd. I mean, his whole goal is to work up the crowd into a frenzy so that they go burn and pillage and, go against Brutus and Cassius. And so again, you have to say, well, it worked, but was that the right thing to do there? Was Brutus, that's a whole conversation I have with my 8th graders. Very interesting. 8th graders have very interesting perspectives on this sort of thing. So talking about the use of rhetoric and words and language and in that play alone is very interesting to see how they're used for good and for ill, and how do we define good or ill? Ultimately, it should be in submission to how God defines it. Yeah, Daniel.
Follow-up question from someone on watching online. It seems that language is not enough to bring victory over NICE near the end of the book. Animal ferocity plus other powers play into it. Do you have thoughts about how language fits with will, power, etc. in the pursuit of the good? So somewhat related, but
yeah, that's a good question, and does remind me. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about the biblical imagery in that His strength, specifically talking about Tower of Babel imagery, which obviously leads to talking about language and the NICE. Right? We have this. I think that scene is amazing at the chapter where their speech is all garbled, because I think it's very poetic sort of justice. They've been messing around with the image of man, or image of God in man, right? What is man? And they've been trying to remake man, what it means to be a human. And so they've been messing around with that. And so in a kind of just sort of retribution, they are the one of the marks of what makes a person a human being and made in the image of God is removed from them, which is their ability to communicate. And it's not even just another language, it's just total nonsense, right? Total gibberish. And they're taken out by animals, which is also kind of a sort of poetic thing. So, and Merlin has that wonderful line in Latin, and now I'm totally forgetting what it is. I have it here so I can find it. I know, what is the line in Latin? Can you tell me? It's the banquet at Belbury. That's what I was looking for. I just saw Blotcher Bulldoo, mumbled Jules. Yeah, this is a pretty good example. Let's see. Okay, so it's, the translation is, they that have despised the word of God, from them shall the word of man also be taken away. He says it in Latin. It always sounds better in Latin, but that's the translation. And so he clearly, Lewis is clearly doing a poetic sort of thing. So could you repeat the question though? Because I think I kind of got off a little bit from the actual question.
it seems like language is not enough to bring victory over NICE near the end of the book. Animal ferocity plus other powers play into it.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on how language fits in with will power?
Yes. Well, so my first language, the comment about language not being enough. Well, of course it's not, because God spoke and it came into being. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. There's this union between soul, spirit, body. There's a union between the Word and the physical material world. We don't want to go from rejecting materialism to then being Gnostics, right? I mean, like, you can go both directions. And so I think so obviously there's multiple things working together in when the NIC is taken out. It's not just, Merlin doesn't just go in there and say a magic word and poof, they're all gone. They were messing around with the spiritual world as well as the material world, and both things take vengeance on them, basically, in the end. So I think that's a very interesting scene to look and see how it plays out. So I mean, I would agree that it's not just like one magic word you can just say, and but there's also the wonderful line in Luther's hymn, right? One little word shall fell him. So that word, so there's all sorts of things we could talk about here. It's a great question. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? No. Okay.
Tell everyone about the appendices.
Ooh, the appendices, yes.
My favorite part.
Yes, they are very fun. They took a long time. So there are a few appendices in the back of the book. I'm trying to remind myself what there is. So we have there's just a nice timeline of Lewis's life and publication dates of all of his books. And then we have a glossary of characters, places, and Old Solar. So if you're just not quite sure what a phrase means or in Old Solar, or you want to look up a character, they're all alphabetized there in Appendix B. And then my personal favorite is Appendix C, which is an index of all allusions, quotations, and translations from the book. So anytime Lewis quotes something and doesn't tell you where it came from, it's in here. It's arranged by in order of the books. So if you come across it, you can just turn to That He Is Strength and find the chapter and the page, and it'll tell you. So, or if there's anything in a foreign language that he does not translate for you, it's in here. I've translated it. So any poetical allusions or quotations, they're all in there. It took way longer than I thought it would. It was kind of I wrote this book originally as a master's thesis, and it was kind of a last minute decision. And I was like, maybe I should just do an appendix like that. That'd be cool. It wouldn't take that long. And I jumped into it, and it took a really long time, especially That He Is Strength, because Lewis is cruel, and he's probably laughing at me right now, because there's this whole part where he just rattles off in That He Is Strength. He rattles off a few people that visited Bragdon Wood, and one of them, some of them are historical, and then one is completely made up, that he just made it up. And then he talks about this poem in Anglo-Saxon or Old German or Old English, one of those, that was written by a poet who really existed but did not write that poem, and Lewis just wrote that line of poetry. Then he made up a World War II poet, and he made him up. And so I was looking for ages and ages until I finally found some obscure book that had a footnote that said, Lewis just made this up. Thank you very much. He's probably laughing. He's like, ha 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 ha. I knew that would trip someone up someday, right? And he does things like that, where he has like a string of actual historical people that really exist. So you do look them up and you're like, oh, this is cool, this makes sense. But he'll mix in things that he just thought were cool and mixed in there. So I did that work so you don't have to. So that's there. And it's not quite exhaustive. I know I've still found a couple, I didn't include that. But it's as exhaustive as I could get it at the time. No, second edition might have to add a couple things, but so that's I quite enjoy that, because I'm the sort of nerdy person that loves that sort of thing. I was like, I want to know where that quote came from, and then that quote actually, where it came from gives more insight into this entire scene. It actually adds something to the scene that I didn't really know how or why it did, but now it makes sense. And I do talk about some of those in a certain chapter when I talk about poetry and Paralandra, because most poetic quotations are in Perelandra, and I think that's on purpose. And I talk about that in there. So I do unpack some of them, but I realized very quickly that I could have 1,000,001 footnotes and make everyone mad at me, or I could just put this all in an index. So I'm gonna do that. And that way people who don't care at all and just wanna read the book can, and people who want to nerd out over that sort of thing can. They can go to the index and we can nerd out together and have fun on that. So yeah, that's a fun part. I really enjoyed doing that. I probably could just do that as a living if I didn't have other things to do, and if someone would pay me to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah. So this is something I had wondered before, and I just was reminded of that. Do you think that Lewis had a unified vision for the trilogy? Like when he started the Malekith, outside of the planet, was he thinking, I'm going full trilogy with this?
I don't think so. Just based off of Lewis's personality and things he says elsewhere, I think he's more of a shoot from the hip kind of just cowboy, like which drove Tolkien nuts, right? Tolkien was not that person, which is why they had this. It kind of came out of this contest they were gonna have. They were like, there aren't enough books of the type we like, so. He called Tolkien Tollers, sometimes Tollers. He said, Tollers, you're gonna write a time travel book, and I'm gonna write a space travel book. Well, Tolkien never finished his. He started one, it was called The Lost Road, which was meant to connect Middle Earth to our time. And he started it, I believe, but he never finished because, it wasn't gonna be perfect, right? And so, I don't know, that's my theory, is that he was very much a perfectionist sort of thing. And Lewis, he took it and he didn't write one space travel story, he wrote a trilogy. I don't think he planned it. I think, especially with some of the differences in style and tone and purpose, I think he started out with kind of one vision for the first book and one purpose and point for it, and then it kind of just, it's like, he realized I have to keep going with this. And then at that point he may have, and I need to look, I don't think I came across anything specific that he said, so it's more of a just from what I've gathered, is that Perelandra and That He Is Strength were more planned as okay, now I'm writing 2, I'm gonna write a third one. Like, because Perelandra doesn't end, I think you can tell there's gonna be a third part. But the first book, I think, could stand on its own as its own, with its own point, which is to kind of reawaken our imaginations and to a more biblical view of the heavens. And he even says that at the end of the book, like, if I have affected that change in my readers, then I've succeeded in my point, basically. He says that. So, just from what I know of what I've gathered from Lewis's personality, I don't think he planned it as a trilogy. And yeah, he didn't really plan things like that very much. He's just kind of like, I'm just gonna do it, which drove Tolkien nuts, because he just like churned out the books, right? And Tolkien's like spending eons on, the moon phases have to be right, for goodness sake, right? Like, oh, the moon's phase is wrong, I have to scratch that and start over because the moon wouldn't be there. And you're just like, thank you, Tolkien. Yes, Cooper.
On that note, do you think that the series suffers as a result of that in your personal, what you think of the series and like what you've talked to? Do you feel like artistically it suffers, like it's not coherent enough, like it's 2 tight books and then the third one?
Yeah, if he'd planned it a little more carefully. Yeah, that's really hard because it is so brilliant. I think it is brilliant. And, I think one of the hard things, each book is so different and does have a different feel to it, which I think is partly on purpose. Each book is set on a different planet. That itself is going to change entirely the atmosphere of the book, which I know Lewis did on purpose. Out of the Silent Planet, set on Mars, has a very different feel from Perelandra, which is on Venus, and that's just by nature of the setting and the atmosphere of the book, the story, the plot itself. And then That He Is Strength is the only one that takes place here on Earth, so that lends a different feel to it. And I think he was doing something, and the other thing is that he wrote That He Is Strength after he had formed a really close friendship with Charles Williams. So the whole Arthurian legend myth thing kind of got really into that between Perelandra and That He Is Strength, which I think it clearly affected it very deeply with the whole Pendragon thing, Logris, and all of that. Like, there's a lot that he infused into that book that I think was a direct result of his, of Charles Williams' influence on him. And so if he had known Charles Williams earlier, would that have changed the trilogy? Probably. I mean, Lewis was a a culmination of all of the parts that he influenced him. I mean, we all are, right? And so I definitely would have been different. Would it have been better? I don't know. It's not for us to say. Yes.
Since Michael Ward's discovery of Narnia's correlation with the seven planets, is there any significance with the trilogy, the 3 planets that he picked with the trilogy? Knowing that he could work with all 7, why do you think he picked the 3 that he did for the trilogy?
Yes, so I do talk about that a bit in my book. So I see Ransom as a character being particularly shaped by each of the planets. Also, I make the argument that they line up with Dante's Divine Comedy. So Mars, the first one, is kind of Ransom's Inferno, if you will, and then Perelandra is his Purgatorio on Venus, which, I mean, you can kind of see he goes up. There's the mountain at the end that he climbs, and Purgatory is a mountain. Venus in Dante's Purgatory, when Dante is brought up by Virgil from the Inferno, from hell, and then he first sees the mountain of Purgatory. There's a planet in the sky, and it's Venus, that he sees right before he goes up Purgatory. So there's lots of connections I kind of explore there. I think he was very influenced by Dante, and we know that because he said it himself. And so I think, and there's an element in which in each book, Ransom starts out on Mars, and in Perelandra he has become martial himself. He's the embodiment of kind of a martial figure. And then in that he has strength, he becomes more of a jovial figure, very, very clearly. And so I don't know. And there's also the sense, though, that all of the trajectory is back towards Earth, right? We come back to Earth in the last one. So I think he chose them, to answer your question, I think he chose them on purpose for a reason. There's a lot of patterns and thought put into it. I think a lot of it is Lewis's genius. He's just kind of swimming in this sea, and so he can't help but infuse that into his writing, because he wasn't known for his perfectionist planning. But we know he's a sort of author that you read over and over again, and you keep picking up little details that all feed into just the brilliant tapestry that he's created. So I don't think he was quite as slapdash as Tolkien thought he was. I think he was just very, very talented and could throw things together that were brilliant in a quick way that drove Tolkien nuts, which I think we can all kind of relate to. There's always that one student in class that seems to never be paying attention, and then somehow they ace the test, and you're just like, why? I studied so hard for that, and I got a 90, right? And you didn't study at all. You got a 98, and so I think it was kind of that sort of relationship a little bit with them. So I do think there was reason and rationale behind the planets that he chose for each of the 3 books. Okay. Daniel.
So Brittany Harkey asks, is there a connection between Ransom as a philologist and Mercury?
Yes. There you go. Yes or no question. Yeah, No, I definitely, well, even in the segment that I read about Mercury, right, it says that Ransom, whose study had been for many years in the realm of words, to him, it was heavenly pleasure. So he pulls that out, that he was a philologist and he loved words. And so this is just, to have Mercury himself be there in that room, it was just the best to him. And we see again and again that's a theme with Ransom. I mean, he is a philologist, so even in the first book when he's trying to learn Old Solar, he's fast. It kind of even cuts through his fear. He's like, wait, there's a language, I could learn it, right? And so he's very hungry for language and learning in that sense. So there's the kind of this constant layer of, I think, a mercurial spirit in Ransom just by nature of his day job, as it were. Yeah.
And last one from online. How, if at all, does the character of McPhee contribute to the narrative? I found his character delightful but elusive in purpose.
Well, if you're going to write a book oriented around the planets, you need a Saturnine character, I think. So I was doing this the other day, actually. I was like sitting down, okay, do all of the characters in St. Anne's actually line up with the planets? And I was kind of fiddling around with it. I'm like, I think there's probably a way that they do, but I haven't figured out one that just clicked quite yet. But I think McPhee is clearly Saturnine. He's very pessimistic, just constantly kind of doubting everything, right? I think they need that sort of balance, and they need that character that's very realistic and down to earth and just saying, this isn't gonna work, basically. Puddle Glum. They need a Puddle Glum in St. Anne's, right? To kind of balance out the other characters and their personalities. So, I haven't done too much more in-depth research on McPhee, but I know he's based on a character that Lewis knew personally. Oh my goodness, I totally lost his name. His tutor when he was young was a Scottish tutor. What was his name? I'm losing it now. Someone will remember it at some point. And he based it on him. He also based Professor Kirk a little bit on, is it the old knock, hard knock, big knock, something like that? The Great Knock, right? Is that what he called him, I think? I think so. And so he based Professor Kirk a little bit off of that tutor, but McPhee is very much inspired, and I think he says that in a letter at some point, that he was inspired by that character. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you.
And do take a look at this map.
Yeah.
This was done by Josiah Nance, and do you want to actually just tell people real quick what it is?
Oh, yes. So, yeah, this is really,
It's in the
this
book,
is
and
great.
This is the big version.
Because I don't think anything like this exists. So it's actually a map of the fields of Arbel, which is the solar system, as Lewis presents it in the book, because he doesn't actually rearrange the planets to be like the medieval cosmos. It's our system. So when he goes on in Now the Silent Planet, Ransom sees one of the creatures, the philologist, working on a sculpture of the cosmos. And if you note the order of the planets, it's our solar system. It's with the sun at the center and going out. It's not the old medieval cosmos, pre-Copernican, Earth-centric. But this is basically, Josiah Nance took that and he drew it in a medieval kind of style with the names according to Lewis on there, and it's really, really quite good. I did not know they were going to do that, and it was a surprise to me last year. So I'm really excited about that, and it looks great. And I think you can get prints of it.
Yeah, there's a small version in the book, and then you can get prints of it. So, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And for
Thank
those
you.
who are here in person, I'm so sorry that the metaverse does not yet allow wine and cheese to be transferred through the lens. But for everyone here, we have wine and cheese reception and book signing. So, and you can keep talking to Christiana. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.